new EIGRP, which is starting from the 15.0 iOS versions. Okay, so let's start with the EIGRP name mode. It's also called as multi-address family mode because there are some multiple IPv6 and IPv4 configurations can be done under the same routing process. So, and this is something supported from the new iOS versions 15.0 releases, which will be tested in your CCIE routing switching version 5 exams. Okay, so the major difference in the new name mode is it supports something called hierarchical configuration, where all the commands are configured under the same hierarchical design. So it's more similar to iOS XR configurations, where you have one place where all the configurations can be done. So if you talk about the previous mode like classic mode, which we use in general, where we configure with router EIGRP 100, where the commands will be different, like you have some summarization commands you configure under the interface, and also we have some authentication commands we configure under the interface, and there are some other commands like we configure inside the router mode. Now this is something what we have in the classic mode, whereas in case of EIGRP name mode, all the configurations are supported on this under the same routing configurations. So whereas in the classic mode the commands are scattered in a different, like some commands works in the interface mode and some commands comes under the routing configuration mode. Now apart from that, it supports some advanced options like wider metrics, and also IPv6 VRF Lite features are supported in the new EIGRP configurations. So in this video I'm going to getting into some more details on. If you try to verify the configurations on the classic mode, we have different configurations in the classic mode where the IPv6 is configured separately under the separate routing process, and then we have a IPv4 configurations or a separate process like our router EIGRP1, and then we have some interface levels configurations like authentication, summarization. They come in a different way. Like you can see, there is an IPv6 separate routing configurations, and then we have for IPv4, and then interface specific configurations, and also maybe on the same router you are running two different autonomous systems, let's say EIGRP 100 and EIGRP 200. They all come under different routing configurations again. But whereas in case of IP in the name mode configurations, all are configured under the single routing configurations. Now majorly the command starts with router EIGRP, and we can define some instance name for the routing process, and we can configure everything under the same configurations under the same instance. Like I can say router EIGRP CCIE, and then I can define some configurations like address family IPv4. So the first command starts with router EIGRP and the name for the instance. And once we create a name, now whatever the configurations you want to do under the IPv4, then probably we go to address family IPv4 unicast, and then we need to say autonomous system number. And all the IPv4 related configurations comes under a single configuration, single address family here. Now similar way, whatever the commands relating to IPv6 comes under here. And if you're using MPLS kind of implementations, they all comes under the VRF IPv4 and an IPv6 like this. Now that's the reason we call it as a multi-address family, with where in the name mode we can configure this way, where we can have an hierarchical design for all the commands. Now mostly the command line we'll see in the next video. That's one of the major difference in the old classic EIGRP and the new new EIGRP. So whereas still the 15.0 iOS version still supports a classic mode, and we can also use a name mode. So which means, but at the same time on one router you can either run a classic mode or you can configure the name mode. But even though you're using 15.0 iOS versions, you can still use the classic mode. Now all the commands in the EIGRP name mode is categorized into three different modes, we can say. And most of the normal commands which are relating to like network commands or neighbor commands and specific timer commands, or if you want to shut down any specific address family, all these commands comes under the address family configuration mode. And whereas if you want to configure any interface related commands, like in IP version 4, the same thing, like in the classic mode we configure some summarization commands and authentication commands. They all comes under the interface. Now the same commands will come under the router mode, and then under the address family if it is IPv4 or IPv6, and then we go to the interface, like we give a command called AF interface, and then all the summarization or authentication commands comes under the single router mode. but they all come under address family interface mode. And then we have some global configuration commands which comes under topology based configurations like variants, which apply for all the routers. Variance commands or any specific kind of sub configurations, they all come under this topology mode, which completely affects the complete router. So you got three different set of configurations. One is normal routing configurations. You can always go to this mode and you can use a question mark. The always help to see what are the possible options. Like here you can see under the address family IPv4 unicast autonomous system, we have all this set of commands comes here.